Hey everybody, welcome to today's video. Today I'm going to be going over Volta's business model and whether or not they should continue using the same advertising model that they've been using for their whole history, or if they should make some kind of changes to it in order to try and have some more success going forward here. As most of you following Volta probably already know, their business model consists of both charging and advertising. They are at their core a charging company, of course. They build these charging stations, but the main distinguishing factor for Volta compared to all these other charging companies is their advertising. Almost all of Volta's stations have these large 55-inch displays on them that Volta goes ahead and sells that ad space out to other companies that want to advertise on their screens. And because of this, Volta is effectively just as much an advertising company as they are a charging company. Now today's video is about two hypothetical paths that Volta could potentially take in the future to change their business model and end up having more success. And I want to make it very clear before getting into these two things that neither of these are something that Volta has announced that they plan on doing. This is purely just my own personal thoughts on ways that Volta could go ahead and modify their business model that might end up making some more sense for them. So the first hypothetical path that Volta may be able to take is dropping that advertising part of their business model and focusing entirely over on electric vehicle charging stations. So what may be the implications of going ahead and doing this? Probably the biggest downside to going ahead and doing that would be that they would no longer get all of that revenue that they've been making from advertising. This has pretty much been their main and only source of revenue throughout their entire history, whereas all these other charging companies have to have really high margins on the electricity they sell since it is their only source of revenue for the most part. Unlike Volta, they don't have these advertisements that they're running, and with Volta, Volta's able to go ahead and use that revenue that they have to offset that electricity cost and the cost of building out new charging stations. Now, despite these downsides to going ahead and dropping that advertising model, there are still some upsides for Volta if they did go ahead and drop that. And the big thing there is their expenses. Obviously, Volta spends way more than any other charging company to go ahead and build their stations because they do have these giant displays on them. Volta has said that their level 2 chargers cost about $50,000 to go ahead and build and install, and then their DC fast charging stations cost about $100,000. Now, I'd like to point out that those costs that they gave of $50,000 and $100,000 per charger are way higher than pretty much anybody out there building chargers, and I'm not totally sure why they cost so much more. I guess it is just that they have these large advertising displays on them, but I still have a hard time understanding why that increases the cost of building and installing these stations so much more compared to what a lot of these other charging companies are seemingly able to go ahead and build and install their stations for. Now, the second upside to Volta cutting off that advertising part of their business would be a reduction in selling general and administrative expenses. As some of you probably know, Volta has very high selling general and administrative expenses in comparison to other charging companies out there that are at a similar size to Volta right now. So cutting off the advertising part of their business model would probably put Volta's selling general and administrative expenses more in line with a lot of the other charging station companies out there. Now, that second hypothetical path that Volta could take is dropping that charging half of their business and instead entirely focusing on that advertising half. This would function just as it does today, it's just that there wouldn't be that charging component involved. So Volta would be able to build these advertisement screens out without having to deal with all of those costs and all of the hassle of having these chargers associated with it. And this is actually kind of an argument that a lot of people who are more pessimistic on Volta kind of use, is that all of Volta's revenue today basically comes from these advertising that they're selling, and the charging part of their business is just weighing them down essentially. So it really makes sense for them to go ahead and drop that charging part of their business and instead kind of end up becoming just an advertising company that builds these advertising displays, where that's where all of their revenue comes from, and it would save them all of the expenses associated with building out these expensive EV charging stations. So obviously that is kind of the main upside to Volta dropping the charging part of their business and instead focusing on advertising, is that they no longer have to have all of these expenses and all of the hassle with building out these charging stations. They can instead only focus on what's actually making the money, which is the advertising displays. But what might be the downside to Volta dropping that charging part of their business? What it really comes down to is that Volta does plan to begin charging customers to charge at their stations, and this would provide Volta with a lot of revenue from the chargers themselves, not the advertising displays on the chargers, but from the charging itself. Volta would end up beginning to generate revenue from. So instead of Volta's chargers being something that drags down the advertising half of their business, they could instead potentially be something that boosts the advertising side. The reason for this is that as much as that advertising revenue that Volta generates can offset the cost of their charging for drivers, that charging revenue that they're generating can also offset the cost of advertising for the advertisers. So Volta would be able to sell electricity to drivers at a cheaper price than the market average because of that revenue that's coming in from the advertising that's able to offset the costs associated with that. And then on the other side of it, they would be able to sell advertisements to advertisers at a lower price than the market average because of the revenue coming in from the charging that's able to offset some of the costs associated with advertising. Now, of course, Volta could go ahead and do both of these things at the same time. Volta can build chargers that don't have the advertising displays in places where advertising doesn't work as well, and then they can build advertising displays without chargers in places where there isn't really a need for charging, but advertising is very effective. And then, of course, Volta's big thing would be combining both of these things together in places where it works really well, such as retail shopping areas. Now, Volta's business model is extremely capital intensive and they're running out of money, which puts them in a terrible situation financially. So make sure to check out some of my other videos on Volta, and I'll see all of you in the next video.